Let's go ahead and get started as I have 10 o'clock on the nose here. So hopefully everyone can see the presentation okay. And thank you for joining us today. Welcome to part 2 of our Windows 10 webinar series presented by Model Technology Solutions. If you missed part 1, or if you're unfamiliar with the updated technologies in Windows 10, such as Credential Guard or Device Guard, it can be found on our YouTube channel. It's definitely worth checking out. We go through a very high-level overview of some of the enhancements and updates that are in Windows 10, as it is a very different operating system than previous versions. To level set some expectations here, the goal in this presentation is to provide an overview of how Windows 10 will help shape your operations or operationalizing your operating system deployments. And so as we go through, I'll touch on the different pieces and then we'll have a review at the end to help kind of give everybody a level of understanding of what it'll take to operationalize Windows 10 in your environment. So as we go along, I'm sure there will be questions. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. So please use the chat window to ask your questions. You can ask them whenever and we can get to them near the end of the presentation. But for now, let's go ahead and get started and go through the agenda. So we're going to go through a brief introduction. We'll talk about who Model Technology Solutions is, and we'll talk about who I am. We'll take a look at the Windows 10 hardware requirements. We're not going to spend a whole ton of time here, but it's definitely worth noting some pieces of Windows 10 do require specific hardware requirements. We'll review the supporting infrastructure requirements for Windows 10 in an organization. Next, we'll define the Windows 10 branches and releases. That's a big topic of discussion, so we'll spend some time in there. We'll briefly chat about choosing the Windows 10 edition that is right for your organization. We'll discuss the concept of Windows as a service. And again, this is a very new way of thinking when it comes to the desktop, so we'll talk about that. We'll review how to make the most of your Windows 10 deployment, as there's some significant opportunities to capitalize on here. And finally, we'll review some Q&A. So about Model Technology Solutions. So we have 2 primary practice areas. We have a consulting practice, which is a team of experts that are ready to plan, design, build, and really operationalize technology into your organization. Some of the tool sets we leverage in doing so would be Azure OMS, Azure IaaS, EMS, and of course, all things System Center, which is our bread and butter. The second practice area we have is a managed services practice area, which is really an extension of your team for managing day-to-day operations. The technologies we leverage in our managed services practice include Azure DSC or Azure Automation, and we can manage the day-to-day System Center operations as well. Things like patch management or Windows 10 update management, those kinds of pieces. We provide different SLAs and reporting options to help meet your organizational needs and to offload some of those mundane, repeatable tasks. Overall, as an organization, we stay in our swim lanes in our areas of expertise, and really we specialize in building the right solution for your organization from tool sets. And so while we do implement tools and we put infrastructures in place, it's really more about making it a solution for your organization, something you can consume and something that provides value to the company. So let's talk about me for a moment. So I'm the managing partner of Model Technology Solutions. I am in my 16th year of professional IT. Most of that has been in consulting. I'm a father and a husband. I have 1 child that is due in about 8 days or so. Anyone who knows me knows that I don't like talking about CrossFit, but I am a CrossFit enthusiast. Over 10 years ago, which is eye-opening for me, I was the technical editor of Mastering System Center Configuration Manager 2007 R2 that was published by Cybex. And then just recently in 2016, I was a contributor on the Microsoft white paper, The Release Pipeline Model. It was a great experience. I looked at that white paper, basically looking at infrastructure as code from the point of view or the purview of someone that has always done traditional operating system deployment. And so I offered my feedback on that paper. All right, so let's move into the hardware requirements for Windows 10. So because the hardware still matters, before we can get into how deployment operations will be impacted, we have to review the requirements first. And we won't spend a whole ton of time in this section, but it is worth a brief review to ensure that you're aware of any specific hardware requirements for feature sets you want to use. So per the usual, the minimum specs from Microsoft are really basic. To get a much better experience on Windows 10, you'll want to beef up those requirements, but these are the minimums that will allow you to run Windows 10. Although they do allow you to run Windows 10, there's a lot of features that require different hardware. We're going to touch on some of those now. And so Windows Hello is a new feature for Windows 10. And if you don't know much about it, I spent a lot more time in the first webinar going through some of the infrastructure for it and what it can provide for your organization. But it is a two-factor authentication that supports the Windows biometric framework, things like facial recognition as an example. And this infrastructure can be really set up in two different ways: an authentication mechanism that can replace password hashes in the environment, or a convenience pin that allows you to log into the device, and that's kind of where it ends. In addition, inside of the Windows Hello framework, you can also use fingerprint readers. And I think I found the oldest picture of a fingerprint reader I could find. But you can use that as a two-factor authentication as well, but it would also require some hardware for that. We get into something called Secure Boot, and it requires the UEFI v2.3.1 framework, which many things that were shipped in Windows 8 days came with. So if you have Windows 7 in your organization, like a lot of folks, you may want to check to make sure that if you're going to enable something like Secure Boot, that you have that capability within the hardware and the BIOS platform from the manufacturer. And I realize I'm going through these relatively quickly, but again, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time here on the hardware. There's much more deployment operation focused items that we're going to get to. So if you're going to use BitLocker, obviously you're going to need a TPM chip 1.2 or 2.0 in your organization for your hardware. And then if you're going to be doing Hyper-V, again, with the minimum requirements here, they say that if you're going to be doing Hyper-V, you need at least 2 gig of RAM. You probably are going to want to have more than that if you're going to be running Hyper-V on Windows 10, but it is an option to run Hyper-V on Windows 10. And then finally, device encryption will require the TPM 2.0 chip for all Instant Go devices. And Instant Go is it basically maintains network connectivity when your screen is off or in standby mode. This allows the system to update things in the background and keeping it ready to kind of instantly resume so that you can go back to what you were doing when it was asleep. So again, I didn't want to spend a ton of time here, but I wanted to call out a couple of pieces that were worth noting. I didn't want you to get down the deployment road and find out that you needed updated hardware for some of the features, such as maybe you wanted to use Windows Hello for Business and you weren't sure that it required a TPM chip if you're going to do an organizational infrastructure deployment. So, but on to the supporting infrastructure. We're going to spend a little more time in this section here, but now that we've discussed some of the hardware basics and maybe not some of the not so basics, let's discuss the supporting infrastructure requirements. And this is an important step in the operationalizing of Windows 10, as these will likely change frequently. And what you're going to learn in this presentation today is that Windows 10 will change frequently. And many of these items that we're going to list off will need updates on a regular basis. And that may be a different mode of operation for a lot of organizations. And we'll kind of go through it as we get into it. But let's talk about SCCM first. So there are several versions that will manage Windows 10. There's a couple of things to note here. I'm going to start with something that's not necessarily on the slide, but you're going to see an update cadence, if you haven't already, that is significantly different from previous versions of SCCM. So updating SCCM to the latest quote-unquote current branch is much easier than it used to be, and it requires a lot less downtime to update the infrastructure. So as a general rule of thumb, you want to incorporate the updates on SCCM on an ongoing basis. And I know for many organizations that have been on 2012 since 1511, You're probably used to seeing that in the console, that there's an update, you can click it, and there is a process that you should go through, running a check or a test DB upgrade on a backup of the database and some other components. But overall, the actual upgrading of SCCM is much easier. But from an operational standpoint, you're going to want to put that into the operational task that'll be done 1 to 2 times per year at a minimum to manage Windows 10 as it comes out. But in the spirit of minimums, if we talked about Windows 10 and supporting the minimum Windows 10 versions that are out there, so supporting Windows 10 1507, which is deprecated, by the way, you're not going to be getting updates on that shortly, and then 1511, which will be out of support here in November, the minimum versions you need are listed on the screen. So 2007 with a hotfix to manage Windows 10, and it does not do Windows 10 deployments. 2012 SP2 CU1, and it will do Windows 10 deployments with the ADK for Windows 10. And then R2 SP1 CU1 will also do Windows 10 deployments with the Windows 10 ADK. But just because those are the minimums does not mean you get full feature functionality. So as you're going through and thinking of putting Windows 10 in your environment, a tool to manage the operating system is very important, and making sure that it's up to date and can handle the infrastructure is critical to the success. So let's talk about some other items or some other management tools that exist that you probably, maybe you've thought about, maybe you haven't, that can help you down your Windows 10 management endeavors. So again, given the nature of this presentation, I'm not going to spend a ton of time here going through the tools, but I'll throw out some highlights. So Advanced Group Policy Management is a great tool for version control of group policies. If you've ever been down the road of implementing or changing a GPO and need to roll something back and are so frustrated that you can't go back to the way that it used to be, AGPM will help you with that. It enables things like approvers, a rollback, a more granular control of group policies. And the version listed there is AGPM 4.0 Service Pack 3 to effectively manage Windows 10 policies. And AppV 5.1 is shipping with Windows 10. But if you haven't looked at AppV in a long time, there are several enhancements over the previous versions. So it's definitely worth a review to see how it fits into your organization. The DART, this is a cool set of tools. It's the Diagnostic and Recovery Toolkit. It's a collection of really admin tools, things like Crash Analyzer, Disk Commander, Disk Wipe, Locksmith, and a bunch of other tools that you can embed as a dual boot or as a recovery partition in your Windows 10 environment. But you're going to want to have Dart 10. If you're doing the BitLocker administration in your organization, and you've ever found yourself needing more robust reports or an easier way for the service desk or your end users to self-service unlock their hard drives through the recovery keys, MBAM will help you out in that arena. So version 2.5 SP1, MBAM basically escrows the BitLocker recovery keys to SQL, as opposed to just Active Directory, giving you abilities to create reports, and it comes with a self-service portal, etc. And the last piece mentioned here is the UEV, the User Experience Virtualization. And so I'm not sure how widely used this is yet, but it's been out for a couple of years now. It enables synchronization of files and settings between devices for theoretically a unified experience. As of Windows 10, excuse me, 1607, it is now included in Windows 10 Enterprise. So some things to be on the lookout for, that if you're using any of these tools in your environment, from an operational standpoint, to bring in Windows 10 to manage them effectively, you're going to want to bring all of these up to those versions. Now, we're going to talk about activation, and what you'll see here is a bunch of hot fixes that apply to KMS servers in an environment. As there are known issues with activating a Windows 10 client when these hot fixes are not installed on KMS servers. Something really to think about when you look at holistically putting a new operating system into your environment. One of the things you may or may not think about would be your enterprise activation. If you haven't thought about it, there is some infrastructure updates that do need to happen for that. From an operational standpoint, I would not anticipate that these would be ongoing, but I guess you never know. So as you go through your checklist of things to ensure are up to date for every version of Windows 10 that is out there, this should be on the checklist. And finally, applications, right? And so my experience with the overall compatibility for applications on Windows 10 has been pretty good. But it is important to test as many applications as necessary with new builds. And I don't mean necessarily just the first build of Windows 10. I mean, we're going to go through and we're going to talk about Creators Update and Anniversary Update and all those different pieces. Applications should really be tested on those different versions. But if you're like many organizations and you have a ton of applications, testing all of them may not be possible or really feasible to do in a short order, right? It takes a lot of time. Or maybe you don't have a dedicated QA team. What we've done in the past is really identified the top X number of applications, whether it's 10, 20 to 30, that are considered either mission critical applications or revenue generators, and really develop some kind of QA process around those to ensure that they're tested with each new build, things that you just cannot operate without. And so I don't want to overlook this piece of it, as that is the bread and butter of many organizations. And without applications to run, the end users might actually be at a standstill, and it could really affect business. So because the Windows 10 versions are easier to update and it appears to be somewhat seamless, I wouldn't take this step for granted. I would test your mission critical applications. So defining what those are and having a list is incredibly important. All right, so now that we've reviewed the infrastructure components, let's move on to Windows 10 itself, okay? So in this section, we're going to talk about the branches of Windows 10 and get you familiar with the terminology. One of the things I've noticed is that this conversation tends to, if you've never heard these terms, it tends to be somewhat confusing. So I was in the same boat. The good news is we're recording this webinar, so you can go back and watch this over and over again. So I'm not going to belabor the points over and over too much, but I do want to introduce you to the terms. So you have current branch, current business branch, and what's called LTSB, long-term servicing branch. So we're going to start at the top, and these are just different ways to think, with the exception of LTSB, which is actually a different build altogether of Windows. Current branch and current business branch is just a way to declare where it's at in its life cycle. And so what I'll go through here is in current branch, in that servicing model, you get feature updates as soon as Microsoft releases them. Not necessarily insider builds, which is another version of a servicing model, but you get, as soon as they're ready for general release, they become available in current branch, okay? And the next couple slides, I'll walk through what scenarios these are really good for, but current branch for business is once a current branch build has been declared ready for business, it is now current branch for business. That tends to signify 2 builds ago going into a grace period. Now I realize that may not make sense just yet, but I'll bring it back around here in a couple of slides. The benefit to this model is basically it's a flag in the computer to say defer updates and upgrades. And it's either enabled in group policy or something like Intune or SCCM. That's where you say that if you defer those upgrades, you're basically putting it in current branch for business mode, okay? And so what you want to do is kind of think about those and how they apply to your business in order from an operational standpoint. The last piece is long-term servicing branch, and this is used for specialized systems like medical equipment or point of sale systems, ATMs. Maybe it's something that's out in a remote. One of the scenarios we came across recently, which is one of the first recommendations we really had for LTSB, is remote PCs that are very poorly connected, that have 1 or 2 functions that they serve, and it is very difficult to get to, and they don't necessarily need to be updated all that often. And so LTSB, the build is good for 10 years, whereas a current branch life cycle or a current business branch is about 18 months. A new LTSB build comes out every 2 to 3 years. So when you think of hardware support and some other pieces with it, it can create some significant challenges. In addition, LTSB doesn't have many of the inbox applications like Edge, the store, Cortana, Mail, Calendar, OneNote, Weather. It goes on and on and on. I believe the clock's actually missing too from LTSB. And that's only available in Enterprise Edition. And so when these models were first released, everyone leaned towards LTSB for everyday use as a way to circumvent the continuous update model, which we're going to learn about. But there's some real challenges with it, right? And so I've kind of alluded to a couple of them, but hardware compatibility and the features inside of Windows 10, we don't recommend LTSB that often. But if you think about it, there are scenarios where it does make sense. So let's take just a little bit deeper dive in each one of those scenarios, and we're going to go to high level still. So in the current branch servicing model, updates, as I said, are released as soon as they're available as soon as Microsoft releases them. They are good for home PCs, a pilot to IT users, which we're going to call Ring 1, and I'll bring that back around later. Early adopters that are business users in your organization, we'll call that Ring 2, and the broader IT users, which we'll call Ring 3. In addition, there is only one current branch that exists at any one time. So there's Windows Current Branch, okay? Let that sink in for a minute. As we go on, Current Branch for Business, if you want to have a testing cycle before new features are set to business users, which I cannot recommend enough, you'll want to mark the flag that defers the updates, which basically puts it in Current Branch for Business. In Windows 10, most of the piloting users will be done with the current branch model because there is no functional difference between the operating system other than the flag of when they get the updates and upgrades. And you defer the updates. It's great for the majority of business or corporate PCs as a way to control what revision on Windows 10 everybody is set to, okay? It's supported for 18 months in total. So keep that in mind. So we're going to talk a lot more about that as we go down this webinar. And again, long-term servicing branch, again, specialized systems, unique PCs, point of sale, ATMs that need a longer support cycle that necessarily don't need the usability factor, but they're running more equipment, okay? Think of factories, warehouses, farms, pieces like that might be a good candidate for LTSB. It's not an option for deferring continuous update process for everyday use PCs, okay? So I know that everyone's thinking they heard 18-month support lifecycle. That means I have to provide an image to everybody every 18 months, if not sooner. Well, we can just go to LTSB and solve that problem. That is not an answer to the solution. All right, so let's look at those release dates for those different servicing models that we just brought up. So current branch right now is 1703. Okay, that is where we are with the current branch for Windows 10. The availability date was 4/11. The latest revision date was 6/27. If we skip down, we can see the current branch for business cycle is actually a different version. It's version 1607. It was available in November of last year, and its revision date is recent, okay? So what this is telling me is that as a business, you should be somewhere in a piloting phase of current branch, and current branch for business is sure to follow soon. If you were to reference the release date of 1607 for current branch of 8/2, and then you go down and say 1607 made current branch for business on 11/29, you can see there's a discrepancy of what, 3.5 months or so. So we're getting close to the point to where 17.3 will become current branch for business. To help illustrate this factor, I have another infographic that might make sense. So this was a good one I found on the web that kind of displays things. So first I'm going to explain kind of some background on this, but we have the date in the background, okay? Then we have, against the date, we have Windows 10 releases. So we have 1507, and then when it was deprecated, which is just recently. We have 1511, and if you'll notice, this first section is current branch, then we have current business branch, and then we have a grace period. So the grace period is once that's expired, you will no longer be getting updates for that build of Windows. So you can see from a shortened timeline against this infographic that starting 11 of 2015, and this should carry us into 11 of 2017, you have just, this one will last us about 2 years, but as the time goes on, it's going to shrink down to about 18 months. And then you'll no longer get updates for 15.11, right? So that means you have to move on to the next version, which would be, in our case, 16.07, then 17.03, so on and so on. This is the new release cadence that Microsoft will be building Windows 10. So I'm going to pause right there just for a moment. So as we're all coming to terms with there will no longer be years between builds, but now that it's months between builds, let's put it into a scenario, shall we? So let's say you're looking to deploy Windows 10 for your organization. The first place to start would be, well, where are we at with current branch and current business branch in the current view, right? So you look at the date. We want to deploy in August, which is the red line that's vertical. And you can see, as I had mentioned, at any one time, we have 2 versions that are in current business branch. So we have 16.07 and 17.03. We only have 1 version at the time that is in current branch, right? And so if we take a look here, we're here, we have current business branch 17.03 and current business branch 16.07. We're going to start deploying. We could really choose 17.03 or 16.07 to deploy on, or we're getting dangerously close to having this release come out into an insider preview or a current branch, which allows us to then start piloting in its early phases, right? So any of these options would be acceptable depending on your timeline. But let's say we go ahead and we choose 16.07 for our deployment, okay? So that deployment is only going to last us until about February of 2018 when we hit the grace period. So then we're going to need to move to 17.03 or Redstone, which will just be going into current business branch. So from a timing perspective, when you operationalize Windows 10, understanding where you are in the release cycles for the different servicing options is very important, okay? Whichever direction you go, you need to have a good strategy in place for updating, managing the different builds. Things like test the builds, test the applications, test the updates, the group policy, the SCCM environment. Those all need to be retested and re-rationalized during each one of these release cycles. Hopefully that kind of makes sense, and that, again, we're recording this, so you can go back and review it. But let's jump into Windows 10 editions. Again, another piece we're not going to spend a ton of time in here, but now that we've learned about the different servicing options, let's figure out which operating system builds are right for you. So you have Windows 10 Pro. Windows 10 Pro has a couple of features. You can join to a domain, group policy, BitLocker, and Microsoft Passport. Things like Windows Hello, right? But Windows 10 Enterprise gives you a far greater number of features, right? And a lot of these were covered in the first part of our webinar, but things like direct access, they were not covered, but Credential Guard was covered, a new security feature, Windows Defender ATP, MDOP use rights, branch cache, device guard, and AppV. All of those pieces are built into Windows 10 Enterprise. So from a licensing perspective, it gives you the most feature set out of the operating system to deploy, manage, and use as you get on the path. Again, some of those features were covered in part 1 of our webinar. So if you want to go back and review that, that's on our YouTube channel. Let's get into more deployment talk with Windows as a service. So let's take this journey and define what it means, right? So Windows as a service. So I'm guessing everyone, you haven't heard of that model that I had mentioned where you have about 18 months and the operating system will, quote unquote, kind of expire. You won't get updates any longer, et cetera. So it may be a new, I guess, piece of information for some of you. If it's not, or if it is, this graphic helps depict the goals of it, right? So the deployment effort, if we look back in 2000, the deployment effort was pretty high for rationalizing applications, updating the infrastructure, creating the imaging, and actually doing the deployment. And over the years, it hasn't gotten much better. And so that's probably what we're all used to. So we'd go through this long planning phase, and we go through a longer deployment of the project, and it would take us years to get through, right? And it probably still takes some of us years, which is not uncommon, and still today. The goal of Windows 10 is to make these minor enhancements, these minor updates over the long haul, where the apps will still need to be tested, the deployment, the image, the infrastructure still needs to happen, but it should be less of a significant impact, and it should reduce the amount of time that it takes to manage the deployments or manage the devices during the deployments themselves. That's the intent anyway, and that is what we are seeing in our managed services practice, which I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But overall, updating SCCM has gotten easier. Updating the operating system bits for Windows 10, if you have a good process for all of the things I mentioned, group policy, SCCM, the MDOP, all those components, as long as somebody's managing that and that's built operationally, things do get easier. So Windows as a service, what does this really mean? So there's two kinds of updates. There's feature updates, which are the, excuse me, the big updates that we just mentioned, anniversary update, creators update, etc. Those will happen 2 to 3 times per year. The benefit there is that the idea is that you update in minor increments, and I say minor, still an undertaking, but minor increments should reduce the impact to applications. If you think about going from XP to 7, that was a significant undertaking from an applications and a preparedness and kind of a timeline and a readiness perspective. Going from 1607 to 1703 should not be that kind of jump, right? So that's the intent behind the feature updates. Now you're still going to have quality updates, which are monthly and cumulative. So what that means is if a PC is off for a long period of time, to bring it up to speed, you only need to install one quality update. So patching is still very much a thing that you have to do, right? I am not advocating in any way, shape, or form, do not patch. You have to patch and manage it, and you have to manage the 2 to 3 times a year feature updates or whatever that looks like in your environment, right? So let's take a look at that deployment cycle again in a different view. And this is pulled from one of the videos that Michael Niehaus put together on the deployment cycle of Windows. And I thought it made a lot of sense. So the Insider Edition is a checkbox that you can go into the control panel of your Windows 10 OS, basically say, I want fast builds, or I want to be part of the Insider program. What that means is whenever they declare it ready enough, you will have the option to update your Windows operating system to that version. I would not put that on a production machine. I would save that either for a machine maybe a spare machine you have at home or a spare machine at your desk to start testing things. Very quickly thereafter, you're going to go into a current branch support, and that's about, give or take, 4 months. That should be when those update rings start happening. So your pilot to IT, your pilot to the friendly business users, etc. So between the time it's evaluated in Insider Edition and it's in current branch, somebody has to be developing the image, the update, the deployment, testing the applications, testing group policy, seeing if there's any updates they need to manage that are different. Once it goes into current branch for business, you have about 18 months total of here, but about 12 months of current branch for business, get it deployed to your users and have it operational for that period of time. Then you have about 2 months of a grace period before you stop getting updates, okay? So this is the holistic view of what a deployment cycle looks like that you'll need to find what that means in your environment, right? Whether that means you can space out the different builds because you have 18 months and there's 2 or 3 released. That doesn't mean you have to go to 1607 directly to 1703. You can probably skip 1703 and go to the next build, right? But you'll have to, very short order, get it tested and get it out the door. But it is a significant amount of more work. from a process perspective and putting it into an operational mindset. So let's take a look at those rings and kind of how they match up, right? So the insider preview should be done on a test or a second machine on your desk, or somebody should be evaluating it. Once it's current branch, then maybe it's piloted to some IT users. Ring 2 would be some safe business users that can give you some feedback on it. Ring 3 would be the broader IT audience. Ring 4 is maybe the second round of safe business users as it's entering current branch for business. And Ring 5 is the general population. So it doesn't really matter how you get it out to the general population, whether it's self-service through SCCM or you force it down as they go through. But again, this is all still part of that consumerization of IT model that, you know, if you think about it, and I always relate it back to phones because everybody knows their phone. And your phone gets a little red bubble maybe, and it says it's time to update. Many people just click the update and move on down the road. Well, our job as the IT servicing department is to give them that red bubble at some point, right? We have to give them that update to Windows and ensure that we've done all of our due diligence with testing and releasing and the applications work, release it to them and either let them choose to do it or force it upon them in some outage or some off hours. Either way, this is kind of the direction that Windows 10 is headed. It's already there. So from an operational standpoint, if you're thinking about moving into Windows 10, all of these processes must be defined and assigned into your environment. All right, so let's get some review and try to get wrapped up so we can get to questions here. All right, so making the most of Windows 10. So some key takeaways, right? When you're operationalizing Windows 10, it is not the same as operationalizing Windows 7, or if you recall the XP days, or Windows 8. Windows 10 needs someone continuously evaluating the features and the releases and the components. So things like feature releases and management of those feature releases to ensure no data leakage or security items are controlled. Things that are controlled through group policy objects, tools in the MDOP suite, the SCCM infrastructure, which will need upgraded 1 to 2 times a year moving forward. And then the ever so important application compatibility, defining a process and making sure someone's stepping through it. You have to determine what servicing option is best for what scenario in your environment. Current branch, current business branch, long-term servicing branch. You have to determine what those processes and how those servicing models fit into your organization, and then be able to operationalize it. One thing to note that I'm hoping that is coming across in this webinar is that your Windows rollouts will be frequent. They will happen much more frequently than they happen today. This doesn't mean just because current business branch or current branch has an entire lifespan of 18 months. This does not mean that you have 18 months is the next time you deploy an operating system. So for example, if you deployed in August, that doesn't mean the next time you have to touch it is 18 months down the road. It's really a continuous responsibility to be going through all the different components and items in it. From an operational standpoint, it will likely require changes to your supporting teams, whether that means a shift in responsibilities, updating of skill sets, realigning, or an operational expense such as our managed services to help assist, right? However that looks in your environment, it is likely to require some impact. It'll be impacted in that arena. It will be impacted. So one quick review before we get to questions, right? I would review all of the components that Windows 10 has to offer before putting it into your environment. You want to avoid the Windows 7 deployment mentality with Windows 10 bits. I've been in many customers that have said, well, we're just going to build a Windows 10 image and deploy it like we do Windows 7. And really, there's so much more to the actual deployment and operationalizing it that it's a disservice if you're going down the path to put Windows 10 in to not start thinking of the processes and all the components and managing them today. Right, so you want to avoid taking that mindset of how you do Windows 7 and applying it to Windows 10 because it's very different. And again, one of the things that is hard to do, and I would even argue that I had a hard time doing it, right? I've been doing deployments for a long time, is to embrace this modern approach to Windows 10 deployment. Because in the end, it's going to be a more updated experience for your consumers, much like phones are, right? And we use that as a benchmark just because everybody tends to have a smartphone, and they all tend to use it, and new features come out and people gravitate towards it. But the idea of that moving into a business scenario for your everyday operating system is very likely to happen with this new cadence model. So embrace it and head down the Windows 10 deployment path, knowing all of these pieces to the puzzle, right? All right, so that is the bulk of the information, but I wanted to stop, and we have just a few more minutes. So if there are any questions, go ahead and get them in the chat and I'll answer them or do my best. So does SCCM have options for WSUS to pull in current branch or current business branch? So the way that that's controlled is you pull in the Windows 10 builds, and there's two ways to service the builds. You can service the builds through the update rings in SCCM through a task sequence. And in previous versions, prior to 1703, I believe, it was actually preferred to not use the servicing rings that existed, but yet to actually import the upgrade WIM or the install WIM and create an upgrade task sequence, which is very easy to do. But it was more, that was the path you wanted to head. And just recently, I've been reading a lot of things that it works better from an update ring perspective. In either case, Luke, to help answer your question, you have to manage the current branch or the current business branch designation through group policy, right? Best practices for deferring updates and upgrades. Just GPO, idea being to prevent users from even seeing the updates. ESP, yeah, that's a great point. So James just asked I would use a group policy object for that. And then obviously you can have either a different OU or control it through a group. There's 100 ways to do it. Have a set of test PCs that would get the fast rings, and then your test users that would be at current branch to manage it. But in either case, James, if you have SCCM in your environment, I would highly recommend using SCCM to manage those rings and not allowing it through Windows Update so that you can control all the different pieces as they come in. Good questions. Give it just another minute or two, and then we'll finish out our couple slides here. Any GPO settings that you consider to be best practice or standards for Windows 10? Yeah, there are. There's because some of the pieces are built in the operating system that you want to control, like the store, for example. There's certainly a list, and depending on what compliance settings your organization is up against, there's certainly a list of a definitive list that we can download. I don't think we have anything prepared today, James, but if you want to shoot me an email, I know some of the consultants on my team have put together a list, so I can certainly see what they have. You're like, enough fluff. I want answers. Anything else? Any other questions that we have? All right, so before you jump off, we have another webinar. This is the part 3 of a 4-part. The first 2 parts that we just went through were not very deep technically. They were more high level and operational. Parts 3 and 4 are going to be much more in the weeds. So if you are a technical nature, you can go down that path. Yeah, I agree, James. There's a lot of group policies. you can download the Excel spreadsheet and go through one by one and figure out what you need. But the webinar, the next webinar is scheduled for September 12th, and you can find us there, get registered for it. It'll be much more technical, kind of down deep in the weeds. And again, get in touch with us, right? So we're a consulting company and a managed services partner. So whether you need some help getting the engagement, getting the process lined out and getting you down that path to where you can operationalize it, or it's a combination of having us manage the day-to-day operations after we get what you need to have put in place. Our managed services monitors things like Windows 10 operating system builds, the update rings, the staging, acceptance, and testing, the monthly updates, the rollout of the operating system, and then updates to SCCM. So if you're looking for a turnkey solution, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. And it looks like Scott's got a question. So will episode 3 reference deployments via SCCM? I believe so. One of them is the technical deployments, Scott. Let me see what we have. Yeah, so it's either going to be 3, I believe actually it's 4 that's going to be the really deeper deployments of Windows 10, Scott. You bet. All right, that's all that I had. Again, all this information can be found out there through Docs through Microsoft and other community resources. If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. This video will be posted on YouTube once we get it done. So thank you for joining.